Welcome to the Creator's Crypt. My name is Russ Adams. I was a special effects artist for over 25 years. I created creatures and props for films, television, and even commercials. I wrote 6 how-to books on special effects projects, and I starred on a reality show where we had to build creature suits and animatronic puppets in 2 to 3 days. So artistically speaking, I feel like I have a lot of experience to share. But enough of that. Let's get into this art stuff. Welcome to the Creator's Crypt. Again, my name is Russ Adams, and this week, let's talk about the hustle misconception. Now, I brought this up before, but a lot of times when I'm talking about things like these misconceptions, it's because it's a common occurrence within the art career field. It's something that most artists have to deal with on a regular basis. And of course, it's also happened to me. So when I talk about things like this in the podcast, I'm really just trying to bring my experience to bear in the conversation. I can't really know what's going on in other artists' minds, but I have a good idea or a good sense of it, having spent 30 years listening to other artists bitch and moan about the same things I bitch and moan about. On that happy note, let's get started. The one thing that we hear all the time from the general public is, it's just arts and crafts. It's not a real job. So what the hell constitutes what's a real job and what's not? So let's break this down really quick. A job is basically something that you do to get from one point to the next, or something that you do because you have to do it. It's not something that's intended to be long-term, at least for most people. But if we talk about a career, then a career is something that people do because they feel fulfilled in what they're doing. It's a culmination of an investment in a particular career field that you want to do for the rest of your life. So now that we've got that straight, how does being a professional artist meet those criteria? Let's start with the first category, effort. Okay, another thing that we artists hear on a regular basis is that art doesn't take a lot of effort. And I talked about this in the client misconception episode, so you've already heard me sound off about it, but I'm going to go over it again in a shorter amount of time. Now, I don't know about other artists, so I'm going to go ahead and just take this from my perspective. And I'm going to pick a subject that would essentially generate the most animosity among the masses as something that would constitute getting paid as a real job because of the work and the subject matter. So I'm going to talk about a puppet build, because the general public sees puppets as being child's play or cheap, which is the furthest thing from the truth. So let's dispel that bullshit right now. First, I have to convince a client to hire me. People in the industry know my work and they'll hire me based on that, but sometimes there is effort involved in just the convincing to hire me. I have to prove that I'm the best option for this gig. And if you're an artist for hire, this is something that you have to deal with. When I'm hired, I get to discuss the details of their vision in depth. This usually means I have to sketch out the design on a design sheet from a bunch of different angles and then present it to the client. This by itself takes several hours, if not a couple of days, and it takes even longer if the client has notes and you need to correct things as you go. When the design's finally approved, I'll go ahead and sculpt out the character. Now at this point, I'm not going to put any detail into this sculpture. I'm really just doing this sculpture to get the basic shapes down so that I can pull a pattern from that. And when I say pull a pattern, I basically mean I got to take the sculpture, cover it in saran wrap or aluminum foil, and then use masking tape all the way around so that I can then trace out pattern pieces on that surface. At this point, that sculpture looks like a mummy. I then get to sketch out the pattern pieces over that tape. That means I need to know how things are going to fit together, and it needs to be reflected on those pieces. Then it's the painstaking process of labeling those patterns. That means an identifier for the pattern piece, who it connects to, where the registration marks are, and things like that. So using something like an X-Acto knife or a razor blade, I'll carefully remove the pattern from the sculpture. Then I kind of lay out the pieces, because a lot of times those pieces are rounded off when I take them off the sculpture. So I need to be able to have them lay flat. So that means adding darts. And once those darts are applied, I can then take that really rough pattern piece and transpose it onto a better quality material for future use of that pattern. That means we'll use something like cardstock or pattern paper or something like that. I haven't even really created a puppet yet, but I've already invested hours and days on just this process alone. But now I have patterns that I can use to start roughing out this puppet. So I'll trace those pattern pieces onto something like open cell foam or upholstery foam or whatever I plan on using for this project. Some of those cuts are going to be flat cuts at 90 degrees. Others are going to be beveled out. Why? Because it affects the shape of the character when those pieces are attached to another surface. Once the pieces are cut out, I get to glue them together with some really toxic shit. This isn't going to make much sense, but it's contact cement, so once the glue dries, I can start to assemble those pieces in the proper order, starting with the darts. This also takes a good amount of time because you have to painstakingly line up all the seams. You have to make sure that it's flush, you have to make sure that the ends meet up properly, and that all comes from experience. Now I have what I like to call a puppet in the raw. From here, I'll create mechanisms like the custom mouth plate. And with any luck, that's the only mechanism I gotta deal with this particular puppet. Now, real quick, the mouth plate is usually made out of something like plywood or plastic. It has a little hinge in the back, but most important are the finger holds and the thumb hold and their placement, because you want this thing to open and close properly without having sort of a slack jaw, unless that's part of the character's, visual appeal. But for the most part, you don't want to cause a cramp where the puppeteer has to do something like this for hours and it feels like their thumb is about to break off, because if he moves his thumb this way, all of a sudden he's talking like Bill Murray and, Caddyshack. Once I've got that mouth plate created and inserted into the puppet rough, now I can go ahead and start patterning out what will be the skin. Now, the skin of a puppet is going to be either fleece or fur. So now I can either pull another pattern off the sculpture, which more reflects my need for the skin process, or I can pull that pattern off the raw puppet. And this is usually achieved with a method called draping. So are we starting to see a reflection of the effort here so far? Because there's more. Once those pattern pieces are transferred to either the fur or the fleece, I can start cutting those out and hand sewing them together. Now, with most hand rod puppets, the body and the head are separate. So you take the head that has this sleeve on it and you fish it through the neck hole of the body and it comes out the bottom. You use a safety pin or something to attach them temporarily. And the reason for this is if you need to do a quick change of clothing or a quick change of the head, it's as simple as just separating the two pieces and moving on. Once the head and the body are created, I'll go ahead and start with the arms and the hands. Now, the arms are basically upholstery foam covered, again, with either fur or fleece. The hands are slightly different. In most cases, the hands will probably be fleece, unless, of course, the design calls for them to be, mostly fur, which, if you were thinking of something like a Grinch puppet, his fingers are all furry. But inside the foam of the hand is a wire armature so that you can pose the hand however you want. Also in the hand is this little pocket that's usually right here. And this pocket is for the rod that gets inserted into the hand so that the puppeteer can manipulate the hands and movement during the performance. That rod needs to come out easily and go in easily so that they can switch it out for whatever reason as quickly as possible. Once those things are done, I can start on things like the details, like the eyes, eyebrows, what have you. Then, of course, there's always the costuming. And I won't go into the details of that. I think you know what clothes are. Now, I left out a lot of details in that process for the sake of time. But, speaking of time, that process takes a lot of it. Now, it's different from each type of puppet, but it can take 2 weeks to a month to create a single puppet, depending upon the level of detail required. The whole thing is a massive undertaking. So we're talking about things like, is there effort in artwork? Fuck yeah, there's effort in artwork. And it doesn't matter what kind of art you're doing. There is effort in that creation. So in the general public's eyes, is this going to meet the qualification of effort as to art being a real job? Probably not. Why? Because I enjoy my work. And that's the next category. If you enjoy your work, you can't possibly have a real job. So in the eyes of the general public, I am illegitimately earning a paycheck because I like what I do. Now that suggests that anyone who pursues a career in something that they enjoy is illegitimately earning a salary. So who might pursue a career in something that they enjoy? Let's use the number one American pastime, athletes. And I'm not talking about Olympians. Let's talk about baseball, football, and basketball. They seem to enjoy what they're doing, and the masses seem to see it as a legitimate way of earning a paycheck. And they make millions of dollars. And I don't. So from the general public's point of view, it seems more fiscally responsible for a grown-ass man to throw a ball through a hoop or take a ball and run it from one chalk line to the other than it does for someone like me to create something from nothing. The artist isn't working. They're playing. But the football player isn't playing. He's working? Some would say that he's doing both. Well, why can't that exist for artists too? So there's a really popular phrase for earning side money nowadays, and it's called a hustle. Now, I really fucking hate this word because to me, it defines a process of conning someone out of their money. It means you took something that didn't belong to you and used a really fucked up way of going about it. You conned somebody out of their money or you misled them out of their money. So I don't like the word hustle for that reason. And artists' gigs are not hustles, they're actual work. I think I've explained that in the first part of this podcast. Because I just laid out a laundry list of steps that it took to create a puppet. So clearly, there's work involved. It took skill to get from drawing to sculpture, from sculpture to pattern, from pattern to foam fabrication, from foam fabrication to fur or fleece, and so on. It took years to learn how to sculpt. It took years to learn how to foam fabricate, and it took years to learn how to sew. And I haven't even touched upon the whole mechanized situation that will come with a lot of these puppets. So while a hustle denotes that there is no real investment in what you're doing, you're just sort of making cash on the side, an artist has years of investment in their craft to be able to make money off of what they do. Let's talk about another art form that gets a whole lot of respect at the professional end, but not so much when you're first coming up, and it takes a whole lot of effort. Musicians. Musicians will spend years learning how to read music, basically learning another language. They need to learn how to understand what they're hearing and be able to break it down. They need to be able to craft notes into a stream, making a song, and they need to learn how to play at least one instrument. General public, how many instruments do you play? That's the investment. Learning this foreign language, being able to play instruments, being able to break down sounds so that you know how they go together and what instruments were doing what, how to craft songs. This is all art. And it's all work. And it's all investment. Now let's talk for a moment about those who have this natural skill towards music or towards art. It's not real work or a hustle if someone who takes a skill that they are naturally born with and tries to make money from it. That would suggest that anyone who is good with numbers doesn't really earn their paycheck as an accountant. Someone who is naturally good with engines and mechanical stuff doesn't really earn their paycheck as a mechanic. Are you starting to see a pattern? Everyone else is earning their paycheck except artists. Art isn't work, but it has the same level of investment and the same level of effort. I mean, what am I missing? Oh yeah, physical labor, because art isn't physical. Artists just sit on their asses all day, smoking pot and thinking about rainbows and unicorns. No, they don't. I work with molds, and if it's a plaster mold, those molds are 20 to 30 pounds. And if I add something like a casting material, like liquid latex, and sometimes it takes like a gallon or two to add to that mold, that makes that mold about 50 pounds. And in many cases, because of what I do, I need to rotocast that, which means I'm holding the mold and I'm turning it to make sure I'm getting that material to cover every inch of the inside surface of that mold so that I can then, get my part without gaping holes in it, right? Now, let me tell you, turning that mold for a while starts to burn, okay? And depending upon how many pieces you have to cast, you're doing that several times a day or several times throughout the week. And your muscles feel it. And making those molds is no picnic either. You're usually hunched over the project, adding layer upon layer of mold material to make sure that your mold is properly designed and strong enough to withstand banging around or to, in some cases, hold a liquid. The environment is filled with, plaster dust and clay dust and toxic fumes like fiberglass, and things like, bonding agents and casting materials. And you are usually covered, if you're smart, in PPE gear. And that PPE gear, just having it on feels like you're increasing your workload. You're moving differently because you have it on. You've got a respirator on so you're not breathing all that dust. And yet you've got to breathe, and you find yourself like with certain dust masks, I find myself, my jaw kind of hanging down and I'm breathing really weird. And then my facial feature, it all wipes you the hell out. So for most artists, physical labor is part of the gig. People say that creativity isn't work, but what you're basically doing is you're problem solving. And if you don't think that problem solving is real work, I dare you to walk up to a construction worker and tell them that. Any member of a construction crew who creates a home, builds a bridge, a building, what have you, will tell you that not everything goes to plan. And that sometimes you need to take the skills that you have from the job that you've done for a lifetime or a long period of time. You need to take those skills and find a creative way of fixing the problem on the fly. And you're using your brain to do it. So I feel like I've adequately dispelled the hustle misconception. We've talked about the effort involved. We've talked about, how enjoying your work doesn't necessarily mean that it's not work. We've talked about the hustle aspect and how there is an investment in what you're doing as an artist. We've talked about the physical effort that goes into it and the critical thinking that goes into it. Something I might add is lacking in our fucking country right now because look what the fuck is going on. If there were more fucking critical thinkers out there, do you think we'd have an orange dipshit back in office again? What the fuck? So yeah, art is work. And to the general public, I say, fuck you if you don't recognize it. People who can't do something usually bitch about those who can. It's called jealousy. For the most part, the general public will just never accept the fact that art is a career and a legitimate one. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of The Creator's Crypt. I'd like to thank my friends over at the Collector's Maze Network. If you're looking for a collection of podcasts that are all things geek, then the Collector's Maze Network is for you. Go check them out. There's a laundry list of podcasts just waiting for you there. And as always, I would like to thank my friend Gil Corzo for supplying me with the music for my podcast. Until next week, keep that creativity flowing.